So welcome everybody. Thanks for attending the session on combining Jenkins with deployment automation. My name is Darryl. I'm a solutions architect for Serena software. And today's presentation is I'll be showing you how to use Jenkins to actually deploy to enterprise applications, how to scale that particular and use particular use cases to show you what you need to do to actually, as a best practice, to actually deploy to the enterprise. So this is the agenda today. So I'm going to show you some of the characteristics of enterprise application deployments, using some of the best practices that we kind of developed in our deployment automation tool, using concepts of components and abstraction, so you can actually reuse processes from one environment to another environment. I'm going to show you how to configure and manage Jenkins jobs to actually to either trigger automated builds to environments, do continuous deployment, and or do push-button deployments to other environments that are typically under more control. And I'm going to do all this through a live presentation of the technology. But before I get there, I just want to kind of put it in context, talk a little bit about the technology, how it all fits together. There's some integrations that I'll be talking about today. But I want to show you how they actually fit into the actual process itself, So essentially, I'm going to be showing you a couple technologies, The main technology, Serena Deployment Automation, the automation tool is integrated into Jenkins in two ways, We have a plugin that's a community plugin that allows you to publish artifacts as a post-build step. So once the build is completed, it's successful, and all it's tested, and the artifacts are ready. There's a use case here where you may want to automatically push those artifacts, deploy those artifacts to a particular environment. And that's with our community-based integration. We have another integration actually in the tool itself, Serena Deployment Automation, that allows you to trigger different Jenkins builds. So it's a kind of a Jenkins workflow plugin, but it's somewhat different. And as I present that particular workflow, you'll see the subtle differences. But you can actually trigger Jenkins jobs as part of your deployment process or after the deployment process. A typical use case is that you have tests that you execute on Jenkins, and so you can put that as part of your workflow. So I'll be showing that as well. A lot of people ask me, actually I'm going to ask the audience a question. How many people here are actually using Jenkins for deployment? Not just for CI, but for deployment. There's quite a few, probably 50%. So a lot of people ask me, why would you use another tool to do deployment automation? It's a great question, And it really boils down to, the use case, maybe a level of scale that you have, role-based controls. What I'll be showing you here is some of the governance around the deployment pipeline, So, in a lot of larger enterprises, you have controlled environments. You can't just simply deploy to an environment. It has to be approved. It might have to be linked to a change management system, et cetera, et cetera. You get it. So there are use cases where it would be useful to use a deployment automation tool. And we can get into that as we go through the presentation. So these are the typical things that are attributes of enterprise deployment. You want to modularize your deployment process. You want to try and reuse as much of what you design so you can actually standardize those processes through the enterprise. So I'm going to show you through components how you can actually standardize actually a deployment to a certain type of technology. Role-based deployments, larger enterprises, you have different roles performing different functions, But the whole thing is, it's not about the tools, This whole movement around CD, DevOps is not about the tools, it's not about technology. It's making the process transparent, And so what I want to show you today is that you want to make that process transparent, and you want to alleviate some of those bottlenecks to actually allowing, for example, a QA group to actually deploy to infrastructure that they can do user acceptance testing, They don't want to wait around. Give them the ability to do that, The technology exists. So I'm going to show you some reuse abstractions through properties, And as I go through the interface, you'll see it's a relatively simple interface, and also when you're doing application deployments, you need an ecosystem of plugins and integrations because everybody's application is different. Even though you want a reusable process, as you go from environment to environment, you're going to be working with a lot of different operating systems and different technologies, so you need to integrate to those tools and technologies. One of the plugins I'll be showing you today is this is a relative new plugin. It's the Jenkins plugin, actually in Serena deployment automation, and this will allow you to trigger build jobs across different masters, on different instances. You can run jobs in parallel. You can invoke parallel tests after the deployment is done on your Jenkins build server, but it integrates into all of those builds that you already devised and created on Jenkins build server, and incorporate those into your deployment process. So let me get into the product itself, and I'll show you the technology, how it's integrated, and then we'll save some time at the end to do like a Q&A if you have some questions. So like I said, if you want to do CD, and this is all about CD, implementing continuous integration. Obviously I'm presenting it from a perspective of a tool, but the key thing is that you've got to make the whole process of delivering software transparent. A lot of people can mask, the actual process through technology. So using something like this, or even using something like the build pipeline in Jenkins, you can actually visualize what is actually available for teams to deploy. Where is it in terms of the deployment pipeline? So to give it a high level, this is actually a Java application, very simple. But at a high level, the key thing is that you want people to be able to see is, where is this application in terms of the pipeline? So here we've got a pipeline, the deployment pipeline view that shows you the versions of the applications that are installed. Through this kind of very simple pipeline all the way from dev and production. But also, in more complicated environments, you want to enforce this pipeline as well. You don't want people to just deploy straight to production. So here we can actually put rules in place that enforce a best practice that you've got to deploy to your development environment first, make sure it deploys, it passes all the functional tests, and then have the ability to then promote to UAT, then production in a certain order. And also you can apply a rule that you can actually automate that function as well. Let's have it so that if it gets out into development, it passes the functional test. Let's try and promote that automatically to UAT. And so we can do that as well. But the key thing is making the pipeline visible. Another high-level element is, you want to be able to do push-button deployments. And we can drill into some of the reusable components and how we actually create those workflows behind here. But from a very simplistic view, we're actually in the context of an application, and it knows that we just attempted to run an automation process on development, and now we get the ability to actually choose a particular version of the application. And this is actually using Jenkins as the back end. So every time I actually create a new build, I will actually collect those artifacts, be air files, war files, objects that I wanted to deploy. And this is going to version control those objects, and I can actually choose a version of those objects that I want to deploy. So here I'm going to choose 51, I hit submit, and now it's actually deploying that application back end. So fundamentally, this gives the end users the ability to do push button deployments to essentially to any environment they choose. In real life, you need to put more governance on that, and I'll show you some of the best practices. But we go into some of the best practices of how do you make these processes reusable. So essentially, here we have the process around installing a Java web application. When you install an object like a war file, an EF file, well, first you want to version control that. Everything in terms of being able to do reliable continuous deployment and continuous delivery means that you have to version control the process, the artifacts, and be able to use a combination of those processes and those versions of the artifacts to deploy to different environments. So in this particular case, I'm actually taking artifacts from my Jenkins build job, but then I'm creating a process around that deployment. So the key thing is that you want to make these processes as reusable as possible. And obviously, a best practice is you use the same process as you go from dev, test, UAT, stage, and production. So that you rehearse that all the way to production. So this is a workflow that you can design for a deployment process for a Java web application. In this particular case, you can actually drag and drop the different technologies into the palette and actually create a workflow of how the process for deployment of this particular object should take place. And as you can see, it goes through, if you ever installed on a Tomcat container, these are very familiar steps that you either do manually or you would do through a script. But here you kind of model that workflow, and you can actually devise logic in that workflow. So if it fails, you take a different path. If it's successful, you take the happy path all the way to actually installing that particular application. But the key thing is that you want to abstract any kind of unique properties from the process. And this makes it reusable. If you can abstract those runtime properties like the JDBC connection, the JDBC user ID and password, even to the IP address of the Tomcat server or the service you're deploying to, what you have is a reusable property that extracts the process from the underlying runtime environment. And we can achieve this by using properties, yeah? And so if I go into this particular step, you see on the left-hand side for the Tomcat manager URL, I'm actually abstracting the IP address with an environment variable based on that environment, yeah? So dev has a unique IP address and URL, QA, prod, so forth. And now I have a reusable process that I can reuse over and over again, and I just inject the unique properties for that environment into that process. As you can see, everything is version controlled. You need to version control all your processes because historically, you'll find that you want to run processes that you devised earlier on. So basically, every change should be version controlled so you can go backwards and forwards on that process, inject different properties that are also version controlled as well. So what that kind of boils down to is that at a high level, it gives the ability for users to pick and choose the processes they want to run, be able to collect metrics about successful and failed processes, but essentially go into the environments and actually be able to pick an environment and actually deploy it to as well. And as you see, when I chose deployed 51, it actually pushed it all the way to 51 on the UAT environment. So I used the concept of the build pipeline to also promote from the development environment to UAT as well. Also, in controlled environments, you don't want to deploy it directly to maybe stage, maybe to production, unless there's approval process as well. So you can tie the whole process into ServiceNow. There's integrations into ServiceNow. There's integrations into Jira. Wherever you actually put in those change tickets in, you can actually link into those change processes as well. Or you can actually use the approval process that's actually built into the workflow. So here, I can approve this deployment to production, hit OK, and in the background, it's actually deploying into the production environment. So at a high level, I just want to give you some kind of level setting of what a deployment automation tool does, how it differs from what Jenkins does for deployment. Now, I want to talk about some of the integration points here, and how it integrates with Jenkins, because we're all here for the Jenkins conference. We want to know more about Jenkins. So there's a couple ways that we integrate with Jenkins. Yeah. The typical use case is that you want to integrate it so that when a build completes and it's successful, that you want to automatically deploy that to an environment. Yeah. So maybe to an environment that has less control. It's a development environment, it's a test environment. So we have an integration here that allows you to set up a post-build step. So when the build is completed, we actually link this change, so there's new artifacts, and actually publish these new artifacts into the tool, and then we trigger a deployment process, yeah? So it automatically goes into dev, for example. So, a few simple things that you need to configure, and this is very similar to a lot of plugins that are out there. You need to set up and specify the base artifact directory. This is a Maven job, so everything is put into the target directory. And so everything that is in the target directory is now pushed and published into the tool, and then we can pick and choose which artifacts that we want to deploy. I'm going to version control based on the build number. So I'm going to trigger this build. I'm going to go back to this, and I'll show you it pushing build 52 and its artifacts into the tool itself, and we show you the setup to actually deploying those artifacts. Now the job is building. So we go back to the build job. Also, you specify the kind of regular expression of what artifacts you want to deploy, and a few other checkboxes as well. So you can add a status to this build. So as you get further to production, there's less and less candidates for those machines. So obviously, if you're doing continuous integration, you've got a lot of transient builds, you've got a lot of builds that you can deploy to dev, but when you get to QA, you don't want to waste the QA people's time. You want builds only deployed that have reached a particular status, yeah? Have, for example, passed a certain level of functional testing. So you can actually add a status to your build artifact. So here, I'm going to add a build status ready for quality assurance. So on my QA environment, I can only deploy artifacts that have passed this process, that have the status QA ready. So that way, it filters down the list of builds that can be deployed to the QA stage environment. I can also deploy it automatically as well. So once the build is complete, I can actually trigger a deployment process and actually choose any environment that I want to deploy to as well. So what happens is that once the build is complete, it probably is still running, we'll check. It's almost there. What we get is that we actually push these artifacts into the tool, and they become another release that anyone that has access to the tool can actually then deploy. So we go back to our component, where we actually go to the versioning of the component. At the moment it's 51, but if I drill into 51, these are the artifacts that the Jenkins build server has published, and now I can actually choose this particular version to actually deploy to my various environments. So that way we got an authority. So some people ask me, why do you do that? Yeah, so there's a couple of use cases. A lot of people obviously keep their application releases in artifact repositories. Some people keep them on Jenkins, but that's probably not a great solution. And it really depends on how far you want to go back. So a lot of people want to be able to, maybe for testing purposes, actually redeploy an older build. And so here you can keep your authoritative builds actually within the tool, so you can go backwards and forwards depending on what kind of application you want to deploy. And so as you saw, my build 52 is finished. I've pushed the artifacts in the tool, and when I actually trigger my process, it will go out and actually push this WAR file, this Java web application, through that process I showed you in that Tomcat container, and actually deploy it on any environment that I choose. So at a high level, that's what it does in terms of deployment, integrating with Jenkins, as a post-build step. Also, there's another use case where that maybe you want to involve Jenkins as part of the deployment process. Yeah, so a use case is that you want to deploy to an environment, and then you want to trigger your test jobs that already reside on Jenkins. So in this particular case, we have a process here where we can actually trigger Jenkins builds that are distributed on different masters. We can run parallel builds. But the key thing is you can componentize this and actually add it to your deployment process. So in this particular case, we can trigger off a build. If the build is successful, I'm triggering off parallel builds on different masters. And then if the 2 builds are successful, then I actually trigger off 2 parallel builds to do testings. One's for executing Selenium, and another one to execute tests on a robot framework. So this way, we can actually link Jenkins jobs to the deployment process, kind of reuse some of that, those jobs, that investment, that time you spent on creating those jobs, and actually creating a workflow in the process itself. Now, I'll show you this working just to show this how this actually will actually execute in real life. So if I go back to the application, let's close this down. So in the application context, we can actually trigger different types of processes. Now, one of these processes has been this Jenkins multi-build. So basically, we trigger this, click next, and we can choose a specific version of the workflow. I'm going to choose 43. And in the back end is actually executing those build jobs. And hopefully, when I minimize this, is actually triggering the builds in the back end. So you can see it's triggering one build on one build server. Once that's complete, it will trigger two builds, actually one on each server on the other side. So it's going through that workflow that I showed you. So once that's complete, you can see it's triggering off another build on this particular build server. And if I refresh this one, it should be triggering off another build. And so it will go through that sequence and it should create that workflow. So here we're triggering another build. And what it will do is it will wait for these 2 builds to be successful, yeah? So it actually will combine the logic of these builds, and if only both are successful, then it will trigger the parallel builds for the testing on the other 2 build servers as well. So now we should be almost there to trigger the other 2 builds. But it's a interesting way of incorporating Jenkins build jobs actually into your deployment process. And so you can add build jobs before and after the process. You can run them in parallel. You can define logic between the various jobs to actually test the workflow. So once that run, I'll go back into the remaining presentation, but that gives you an idea of how this particular workflow works. So also, I mentioned you want to apply more governance around your process, your actual deployment pipeline. Because obviously you don't want people to deploy straight into UAT without testing, or certainly you don't want people deploying to production without actually testing on environments beforehand. So one of the things that you can do is actually create a pipeline, so a governance pipeline. So here, what I can define is what are the stages that an application must go through in the life cycle, in the pathway to production. Yeah, I want to enforce that it goes through dev, UAT, through stage, and as many environments that you want before you get into production. So here we define what's called a pipeline. This is a very simple pipeline. I've only got 3 environments in here. But basically the pipeline says here that to get to production, I have to go to dev first, UAT, and through production. And then I can set 2 attributes. The attributes mean, 1, I enforce this, and 2, meaning that it has to go through this particular sequence, and 2, I want to be able to auto-promote as I go through these environments. So as someone deploys to UAT, if it's successful, why not push that to stage and make stage ready with that particular application, so the UAT people QA people get notified and actually know that there's a build out there ready for them to do some kind of testing. So we have a model here where we can kind of govern the deployment pipeline. So we can apply that pipeline to any of these applications. So, and I'll give you an example here. If I go back to my application, drill into my application, go into details. If I was first to remove this pipeline because I have one already applied, what you find is that essentially, depending on my role-based controls, I can actually deploy my processes directly and deploy it directly to any particular environment. But by applying a particular pipeline, what I will do is to actually take that ability away. So the only environment I can actually deploy to is dev, and the rest of the process is that if it's successful in dev, then I can promote it to QA. So here, apply a particular pipeline. This is the pipeline I'm going to apply. So here, I'm saying that you must go through all of these environments to production. Now, if I go to my environments now, if I go to my UAT, you don't have the ability now to actually deploy to that environment. So I've taken away that ability by using a build pipeline governance to actually control that. So the only way I can actually deploy to UAT is first I have to deploy to dev, and then it will promote to UAT and then production. So that's one of the best practices that you can adopt, using this technology in combination with Jenkins. Now, the other thing that you want to do is that you want to be able to identify the status of those builds. So I mentioned to you in the Jenkins job, there was the ability to add a status for those artifacts. And so if I drill back into my component, go back into the process to install the Java web object, if you go into my versions, you see that a certain portion of my application binaries that come from Jenkins are ready for QA. Now you can set any kind of status. You can actually put logic in each of these, so you can have ands. I don't know why that keeps popping up, but you can put ands in here as well, so they have different statuses. But what you can do now is that when you go back to your pipeline, you can actually say that for this particular environment, for example, let's choose, I think I have a rule on UAT, is that I can put a gate. So in this particular case, and back to the best practice, the use cases, that as you get further to production, there's actually less releases that are candidates for those deployments. Now you can actually, in this particular case, when you choose a build, an application release for QA, you actually will only get the ones that are labeled with QA status, and that status originated from the Jenkins build. So you can have obviously different types of builds. You could have CI builds that say it's ready for development testing. Maybe you have longer running tests, and then it would then create a status for ready for UA testing. So there's different use cases that you can apply this. But the key thing is that if it will filter the amount of builds and the amount of available builds that are available for deployment to those upstream environments. So let's, I've got about 15 minutes, 10 minutes left. So I'm going to do 5 more minutes, and I'm going to kind of open up for question and answers, yeah? So if I go back to my application, some other features that, other components of both Jenkins and deployment automation that are useful for the enterprise. There's the concept of snapshots, yeah? And this goes back to my slide. It says, enterprise deployments are complicated, yeah? We are not simply deploying just WAR files that may be executing SQL scripts against a MySQL database. It involves things like maybe making changes to a load balancer, deploying ears, changing property files, maybe there's multiple databases involved. So in real life, you have lots of components that are at different versions that have to be deployed at different times. So what you can do is you can create a snapshot. So a snapshot represents that release bundle. That release bundle meaning that you have a logical representation of an application with multiple components at different versions. So maybe you have some SQL scripts that you version control. You can deploy those at different version numbers on different environments. You have different objects, for example, WAR files, air files, property files. Again, they could be at different versions. But in a nutshell, what it is that when you do an enterprise deployment, there could be 5, 6, 7 components, different versions of the components that have to deploy. So what you can do is you create a snapshot. So in this particular case, what you do is you create a snapshot that represents all those different components at different versions. So I'm just going to give you an example of this. And basically here, I can actually, with this particular snapshot, I can then pick and choose what kind of configuration that snapshot will have. I can choose the particular versions of the components. So here I can choose, for example, it's going to have version 54 of the WAR file or the air file or this property files, yeah? And then we want to give it a status as well, say this is ready for QA. So essentially, when QA is ready to actually deploy the next snapshot, they actually see this is identified as something that's available for them to actually put on their environment to actually test as well. In terms of configuration, you can change things like the component version, yeah? So you can change the version numbers. You can actually change the process that they actually use, the version of the process they use. And also you can change the environments they can actually be deployed to as well. So all of these things are attributes, due to the complexity of enterprise deployments that you want to be able to, be able to have the ability to do, be able to create release bundles where you have release components that have unique attributes, but at the same time be able to reuse processes that you've defined for maybe installing a Tomcat, maybe executing SQL files against an Oracle database and so forth. So to kind of wrap this up, I'm going to just fire off a build and show you it deploy. Show that there's something real happening underneath the covers. So here, I'm going to go to the environment. I'm going to run this particular process, deploy this particular WAR file. Try that again. And by the way, everything I'm showing you today, you can actually, it's freely available. This is community software. If you want me to give you the download URL, just come and see me afterwards, and I can give that to you. So everything I showed you today is based on the community edition. So here I can choose a particular version. I've got now 54. Boom, off it goes. And basically in the background, I can see this running. I go into my deployment history, and basically I can see the history of all the deployments to all the different environments that have taken place. And you can see I've deployed to dev, UAT, production. You can see the process I invoked, the environment it was installed on, executed on, the time it was scheduled, who executed it, and if it failed, if it was successful. And you can see I got some failures here on my UAT environment. You notice that some of these are waiting for approval. And I mentioned to you, you can actually apply approval process if you want to gate that process to stage or production. So if I was to go up here, I could then trigger the approval process and actually deploy that build. But to show you what it's doing under the covers, and I had a little bit of a problem with this earlier on, so hopefully this will work. What I'm showing you is very new. This actually is not released until July the 15th. So this is a kind of a pre-GA version, but as you can see, that workflow I started out with the install of the Java web application and Tomcat container, these are all the steps it went through to actually deploy. You know, the key thing is, you know, simplification. A lot of times it's difficult to actually find the right log and the right part of the log to actually look at that particular exception, yeah? So in this particular case, you can drill into that failure and actually see what actually went on under the covers. And there was some exception here, error deploying. But here, I didn't have to drill for logs. You know, I identified a problem by simply clicking on that. So I have about 5 more minutes. You know, it was a quick whirlwind presentation of, you know, the integration between a deployment automation tool and Jenkins, showing you the 2 integrations that we have. Yeah, I'll open it for any kind of questions and answers. Q&A. Yeah, we have a question over there.
So I have a question.
Absolutely.
When you think about deployment frameworks like Chef or Puppet or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great
What's
question.
like a lot of times we've done Jenkins that'll trigger Chef to do stuff or whatnot. What's the relationship between where you use this versus another? So
I get asked that question a lot, yeah. And quite frankly, the answer is the lines are blurred, right? And because tools like Puppet and Chef, their main problem domain they're trying to resolve was system configuration management, actually converging those systems to a known good point, yeah? And I use the word convergence because that's what they do. They can converge the system to a known state based on a manifest, based on a recipe. So that's the main problem domain that they tackled. But obviously, a lot of these vendors are now saying they can do release deployment and automation, that kind of stuff. So the main difference I see is those tools are still excellent at system configuration management, getting those systems in a consistent state into a known state, and then using a tool like release automation, deployment automation, then to actually do those deployments of those applications. Because behind the scenes, yeah, there can be some real complicated application deployments, yeah? You know, let's go back to enterprise deployments. So most of us, you know, if you've done enterprise application deployments, you know that there's clusters of systems behind there. There's not typically one system that you need to get into a particular state. There's clusters of systems that you have to install the application maybe multiple times on. You might have to adjust the load balancer when you do that. And so there's more complicated deployment scenarios that, you know, quite frankly, you know, maybe a Puppet and Chef aren't that great at doing, yeah? And that's what I see the difference as. Hopefully that's answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was noticing that you, for your app here, that you basically cut out the Nexus artifact repository and just sort of go straight into Target and grab that. Is there anything in the works to actually, you know, grab that from the Nexus artifact?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And then a follow-up question to that would be, would this ever support, you know, non-Java applications like Node.js or Angular, or should they use NPM
That's
or
a great question.
for repositories?
Yeah. So let's start with the first question, yeah? I didn't show you this, but obviously artifacts are stored in lots of different places. You know, if you're undisciplined, you're storing your artifacts, unfortunately, on a file system. You're not versioning control. But obviously, I showed you Jenkins, but the most common use case is you're storing on an artifact repository, Nexus, Artifactory, Archivia, if anyone's still using that. And basically, we have a generic adapter that allows you to basically point to your repository, snapshots, your releases, basically give you your group ID, your artifact ID. But as soon as something gets pushed through your build job into your artifact repository, we know it's there. We set a polling interval, and so that once it's there, we actually know it exists, and it becomes another revision that you can deploy from. So we support that. Now, in terms of supporting lots of different technology, yes, the key thing with application, and it's actually the hard thing about application deployment, is the ability to support lots of different architecture types, different technologies that are part of the deployment process. So, you see on the left-hand side, I've got all different types of technologies that I support, So, in a Java world, it's not simply one container, one technology. You got, Glassfish, if anyone uses it, JBoss, Tomcat, WebLogic, plus many more as well. You got different database technologies as well. Also, you might want to provision a system, out in the cloud, Amazon EC2, Azure. Also, you might want to instrument Quick Test Pro, functional testing, Selenium, those kind of things. And also, back to the different provision technologies, you might want to provision a VMware machine, VM sensor, etc. So there's lots of technologies that are part of the end-to-end provisioning cycle, The unfortunate thing, there's always something that someone's using that's not supported. So one of the things that we're trying to do is make the plugins more easier to develop. They're all written in Groovy. We standardize in Groovy. Typically, they're very easy to develop. And basically, all of these integrations, they're not rewriting, the integration stuff. It's using the SDKs that already come with that particular technology. For example, that Amazon EC2 integration, all it is using is the Amazon SDK under the covers, and I've set some automation steps that executes certain, web services to Amazon. So hopefully that answers your question, So we try our best to support as many technologies as possible, but obviously some slip through. I think that's the end of the time, right? Okay, I'm sorry.
I have one last question.
Okay.
So, I'm sorry.
No, you go for it.
Just wanted to understand two things. The role-based access that is provided by SDA, is there LDAP kind of an integration that is available to provide this?
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah.
The second thing is on how the test data is managed. Is there a...
Test data?
Yeah.
We will take that one offline.
Okay, sure.
I can answer
the first one.
Yeah, I can answer the first two questions there. Everything has to integrate with Actidoric or LDAP, so that's what it does. So easy. The second question, role-based control. Everything I showed you today, role-based controls, every single level, Typical use cases that it had to support, you've got a set of individuals that can only deploy to UAT or stage, We can support that through role-based control. You might have a component designer. You can set role-based controls so they can only modify the workflow. So yes, there's role-based controls and can be set at every different level. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.